From the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, this is the Security Nexus webinar. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army retired and professor at DKI APCSS. Today is Monday, November 20th, and we're confronted with a sobering reality. According to a recent report from the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, the year 2022 witnessed more than 140 disasters in the region, resulting in the tragic loss of over 7,500 lives. These crises profoundly impacted 64 million people and caused an estimated $57 billion in economic damage. Consider the devastating floods in Pakistan, a poignant reminder of the intricate ties between natural disasters, climate emergencies, and public health. From June to October 2022, more than 10% of the country succumbed to floodwaters, claiming over 1,700 lives, injuring 12,000, and displacing over 2 million. The rising temperatures contribute to a cascade of environmental degradation, extreme weather events, and societal upheavals. Climate change's consequences are starkly evident, from rising sea levels and Arctic melting to coral reefs withering and forests ablaze. Clearly, maintaining the status quo is no longer an option. These environmental disruptions, spanning fires, floods, landslides, and more, bring temporary changes but leave lasting impacts on ecosystems and human lives. The pressing question before us is whether our collective capacity and collaborative efforts are adequate to tackle these ongoing crises. Today on the Security Nexus webinar, we'll delve into the seismic shift in security paradigms driven by climate and environmental disruptions. Our conversations will explore the interconnectedness of crises, national and human security implications, strategies for mitigation and adaptation, and future outlooks and recommendations. Our audience submitted questions during registration, and we thank you for your contributions. We'll be addressing these later in the show. Joining us are three esteemed guests recently recognized for their co-authored article in the Security Nexus Journal titled Everything, Everywhere, All at Once: Wars, Climate Change, Natural Disasters, Coups, and Economic Collapse. Please welcome Dr. Ethan Allen, a biologist specializing in environmental and climate-related matters. Dr. Srini Sitaraman, a security specialist with a sharp focus on geopolitical implications. And Dr. Sebastian Kevany, an expert in global health, offering a unique perspective on health security's dimensions. Aloha, friends. It's a privilege to have you here on the program. Please invite you to take a microphone. To kickstart our conversation, I'd love for each of you to share your story about how you became a security practitioner. Ethan, Srini, and Bass, enlighten us with your path. Okay, Ethan, you begin.
Thank you, James. So back in 2012, I received a grant from the National Science Foundation to work with communities across Micronesia on drinking water issues to help them develop better access to bigger quantities and higher quality drinking water. And that experience really got me thinking a lot about climate, the relationship between climate and water, natural disasters, and all these related issues. When the center wanted somebody to work in crisis management, I was able then to frame that work as the best form of crisis management, that is crisis prevention. And so I came here.
Well, we're fortunate to have you here. Thank you. Srini, go ahead.
Okay. Aloha, everyone, and thank you for inviting us here, Dr. Minnich. So my story is a little bit more conventional, but I originally started studying economics. And as I progressed, in many of the questions in economics are always, oh, we can't fix it in economics, we'll have to fix it in politics, in policy making. That's why I transitioned from the formal study of economics to a bifurcated or integrated field called the international political economy. And I come from a pure academic background. So I earned my doctorate in international relations and security studies. And this process began at a very, very early age. And I've taught in a private university before arriving at APCSS. And the reason for arriving at APCSS is here it was a melding, a perfect melding of practitioners and decision makers and people from the armed services all coming together and tackling very important problems. So that was, when the call came out, I jumped at the offer, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be sitting here.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us as well. Bass, welcome back to the show. Tell us your story.
Thank you, James. And if I may, I'll just echo what Srini said about this environment. You know, when I first came here almost 3 years ago, and my initial impression was, this is the X-Men. You know, this is something out of a comic book. The people around me, there's not one single person I could describe as normal or average. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Everyone had this incredible path. And I felt so fortunate to be included in that number. My path was a little bit more drifting, I guess, and not as structured as Ethan or Srini. But there's a quote that I heard once upon a time, maybe a little cynical, but it was, if you want to stay in business, find a way of applying your skills to war. And that's something that in truth, it was peace more than war that inspired me. And one thing that seemed even more important than global health was world peace and cooperation. And of course, there are synergies there. There are ways that one can benefit from the other. And so that path inadvertently, but very fortunately led me here.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. Can't wait now to hear what my X-Men character identification is. Let's start our conversation by delving into the interconnectedness of crisis. The title of your paper, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. I mean, it seems a bit evocative, and clearly it draws on the connections to the chaotic elements that portrayed in this last year's film starring Michelle Yeoh and her colleagues, right? So in the security sector, we often refer to complex crises describing a blend of multiple disasters, both natural and manufactured. So to better understand this interconnectedness, let's maybe dissect these crises individually. And let's go ahead, Ethan, then maybe you could shed some light on the ecological impacts of climate and environmental disruption.
Thank you, James. So the ecology is typically very finely tuned to any given area. The life forms that have evolved in a fairly stable climate regime over the last millions of years. And we are now in an incredibly dynamic situation where the temperature of this planet is increasing at an extraordinarily rapid rate. This is throwing ecological systems around the planet into chaotic states. It's pushing the limits of some organisms, forcing some to move, driving others towards extinction. All of these changes happening all sort of at the same time, compounded by human-induced stresses such as pollution of the environment, makes for a very unstable and uncertain time.
Thank you. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
I'll let you ask a formal question, but I can't emphasize very quickly the rate of species destruction is something that I was not so aware of. I mean, little things like crabs, you don't think about them at all, right? And they're disappearing at parts of the planet. That's worrisome.
Now, I heard recently, shockingly, the extreme number of extinctions that are occurring in the ecological world. I mean, I think we'd be I don't know if shed some light on, a scope to what that number is, but it is extreme.
It's particularly staggering how many of these extinctions are, or at least declines, are happening in species that are sort of low in the food web. That is, they lie at the base of things. So insect species around the world are declining. Plankton in the ocean, plankton populations are declining. Very worrisome.
And it's giving rise to some form of insects that are destructive. There's the one that destroys the trees, a specific kind of beetle.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, I was in part of South Dakota recently, and was just amazed at the the devastation of the trees there by, as you said, a form of a beetle that had born into and just destroying the environment. Well, Srini, since you started in that direction, just pull this a little bit further now and talk about the geological. The geopolitical perspectives of all of this.
Sure. As you mentioned in your introduction, I was sitting on a plane, much like many of us, and I turned on the TV, and there was this movie, and this I didn't think very much. It was a very unique movie. In this character, Michelle, it was she jumps through multiverse. And she's simultaneously fighting different kind of battles in the multiverse. In one, she's fighting some kind of physical threat, and other she's filing tax returns for the Internal Revenue Service, in which she's facing enormous difficulties with. So I didn't think much of it, and then after being at the center and wandering around and listening to the different things that happen here, I'm thinking there are too many things happening on the earth at the same time. I mean, not unique. It has happened in the past, but particularly either because now we're more aware of it, or more number of things happen. Wars in key corners, multiple wars, kinetic warfare, bombs, rockets, terrorist attacks, climate change, environmental pollution, forest fires, ice melting, flooding, you name it, species destruction. Why is this happening? Why, at least to me and to us, rather, why is it everything seemingly seem to happen at the same time? And in physics, there's this concept of simultaneously, which is a very complex concept. And I sort of, stole it or adapted it to this. And there are multiple things can happen at the same time, and what kind of framework we view it. And to me, the best framework to view is this climate change. Right? And because it seems to be a driver that is not visible to us, and we don't see it. It seems like an imaginary thing, but it seems to be at the background driving a lot of these things, at least having indirect inducements in producing, including the most recent pandemic. And that's why we brought Bas in as an expert to think about health issues related to that.
Well, with that introduction, then let's go over to Bas. So let me just ask you then, from your health security viewpoint, what are the key dimensions in the context of climate and environmental disruption?
Thank you, James. It flows so naturally from what Ethan and Srini just said on so many different levels. It has to do with human proximity to animals. It has to do with living space, air quality. It has to do with globalization in its less benign forms in terms of the movement of humans. It has to do with scarcity of medical resources and health systems. There's so many ways in which climate change and conflict and all of these multiple issues that we are currently facing play into health. And if I may, I'll just expand on what Srini was saying. Maybe I'm getting nostalgic, but in the old days, by that I mean 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, it's like we had one event happening at one time. 1989, okay, the Berlin Wall comes down. 2001, you have 9/11. It's like there was one thing happening at a time. And maybe it's the fault of our modern communication systems, but I think a lot of us feel that this is multiplying exponentially. And we don't just have individual segmented challenging events. They all work off each other and they compound each other, which is where the health dimension also comes in.
It does, and pulling on that health dimension, I mean, must be seeing greater spread of disease, the flow of populations, the impact that has on their health, lacking in the food and water security. I mean, it just must be, to your point, just multiplying.
I'm not the expert, and Ethan is definitely the expert on it. And just as a point, I just finished reading an article on how desalination has really driven some of the Gulf economies. They're desalinating enormous quantities of water to build massive structures, indoor deep dive pool, cities that have been dredged up, extremely tall buildings, so on and so forth. And this is all driven by desalination. And other countries are also jumping on the desalination bandwagon. And it is a very expensive thing to do, including states like Arizona are thinking about it. California is already doing it. But the thing is that there's a cost to it. I mean, there's a definite cost to, once we introduce a technological tool to monitor, to modify certain behaviors, we are definitely going to pay a cost, and we don't know what the consequences are yet. But that's one example of the interlinkages between you. So you say there's less water, I'm going to take it from the ocean. It doesn't work because the salinity of water is high in that region.
Ethan?
Well, yes. The issue is, of course, the oceans are, for all intents and purposes, an infinite supply of water as far as humanity goes. But our traditional sources of surface water sources, such as lakes and rivers and the aquifers, are not. Those have been declining and getting depleted and getting polluted. And so people are turning now, of course, the ocean very sensibly as sort of the only place to go, as it were. But of course, in the process are now producing brines full of really toxic materials, which if you dump them on land, leave your land essentially unusable. If you dump them back in the ocean, typically, at least locally, are quite toxic. So yeah, everything is connected to everything else here.
Interesting. Well, let's pivot our conversation a little bit now. Let's direct our attention to the critical national and human security implications that stem from this climate and environmental disruptions that we're talking about. So your research suggests that the world is fundamentally unprepared to confront multiple wars, natural disasters, economic failures, political coups, all at once, because leadership, both in its domestic and international setting, is not thinking in terms of simultaneity. So for governments to be unprepared suggests that the rise of complex crises may adversely affect national security and human security. Sebastian, drawing from your expertise in health security, could you illustrate the health challenges that are resulting from these climate and environmental disruptions?
James, yeah, I had mentioned proximity to the natural world, the animal kingdom, but that's only one element. If I could use an example from the region, I've been fortunate enough to spend time in places like the Solomon Islands, and there they house what you might call climate refugees from the Kiribati and elsewhere, who also, of course, bring their health conditions with them. So there you have an immediate problem, and it's not limited to that. You get more compressed, condensed, I should say, populations, greater urbanization of populations, all as a result of this climate change element. But on a positive note, what I think we learned from COVID, and maybe we can apply to this climate change dimension as well, is within the problem lies the solution. I don't know if that's a cliche or not, but if you think about COVID, it was new territory. For the first time, the flow of information was being shared in such a way across countries. To give the example of countries beginning with I, Ireland was learning from India. India was learning from Iraq. Iraq was learning from Israel. You could go on and on. It was a unique pivot in global history. And I think if we can apply that response, and maybe it will happen automatically to these climate-related health challenges, the solution will emerge.
Thank you, Beth. And I was thinking about, even in the opening, I spoke about the last year's environmental crisis that had in Pakistan that had just massive human implications. The health security concerns were significant. But then just a couple of years before that was the brush fires that were just raging through Australia. And just a few years before that, you had in the Philippines was hit, very hard with Typhoon Haiyan, and these crises, as Srini spoke about earlier, they just constantly, and then the health security challenge. I mean, people, it's not like they happen without any consequence. People's lives are drastically affected, and we ask ourselves, for whom are we providing security? And it's the people, right? And so we must think about how we're providing for not just their traditional security, just their sovereignty, but clearly their health security implications on this.
Well, I think the idea, and Srini and Ethan can perhaps expand on this, is that we are gradually, fortunately, moving away from compartmentalizing these issues, these terms. So in the old days, again, not to be nostalgic again, but you had a health department that dealt with health issues. You had a defense department that dealt with security. The more we can blur the lines and interdigitate and interdepartmentalize, to use a governance term, I believe the better. And in that as well, I think the solutions lie. If we look at security responses to health, health responses to security, agricultural responses to climate, then I think we will progress unexpectedly fast.
Go ahead.
Yes, the development of the vaccinations for COVID was a classic example. That was not done by any one group or any handful of groups. That was done by laboratories around the world, private labs, public labs, university labs, all working together. They looked at problems, they communicated effectively, they divided up the problem into manageable chunks, they transparently shared data with one another, and we had this whole brand new RNA vaccine technology came into being and got widely disseminated within a remarkably short period of time. So we do have amazing capabilities if we're willing to use them.
Srini, I want you to pull on something here for me real quick. So we spoke about there are real health security implications to what's going on. But I started off saying that you guys said that governments are unprepared. So there are national security implications too. Real things happening to national security as well. Sovereignty or these different issues. But maybe from your perspective, just talk a little bit about that, if you will. What are governments experiencing because this is happening with their national security?
I'm going to go step a little back. At our center, in our courses, especially in the long courses, we do this exercise called causal loops.
Yes, that's right.
And I've had, mixed feelings about it. And this is exactly a causal loop problem, right? Because if you think of causal loops, typically as a economic students, we are taught to think linear, right? There's a dependent variable, there are sets of independent variables. The independent variables impact the dependent variable.
This is not a linear problem.
This is not a linear problem at all, right? And the more you think about causal loops, you don't know where to begin and where it ends, but everything is absolutely linked in this. This is, you mentioned this earlier in the beginning here. This is about this notion of chaos theory, sort of you alluded to, right? The butterfly impact, the butterfly flaps its wings somewhere and something happens. And it is a fancy theory, it got quoted, but really we're feeling the impact. For instance, let me give you a more concrete example. Pork prices, they fluctuate, and there are certain countries in the world that consume enormous amount of pork. But you don't think of it just as pork prices, but you have to think about the grain that goes to feed the pork. And they come from particular parts of the world. And Ukraine is conflict-ridden. A lot of grain and grain products come from there, right?
Well, absolutely. And these things can bring down governments, could they not? If when people can't eat and they're protesting, and before you know it, they're dissatisfied with the government, and these things just
right. And think about it. And animals, not for the pigs necessarily, but cows, they release a lot of methane, right? And if you're going to consume a high amount of animal protein and you have to sustain this large animal population, livestock population, that has causal impacts outside of our consumption behavior.
Yeah, these things keep feeding back into
the loops.
Problem, you get another problem, that begins another problem. Ethan, were you going to say something?
Yes, well, this gets into sort of how we are wired, how our brains work, right? We can only hold so many crises in our heads at one time. And in particular, we are very ill-equipped to deal with slow onset crises. We do not see these creeping incremental changes as being a crisis, and we are sort of incapable of thinking about them. Meanwhile, there always is something else happening urgently in front of you, some war, some conflict, some disaster. So
frog in boiling water gets boiled.
Right, yeah. Our response to the underlying issue here of this climate change sort of keeps being back-burnered until it's going to be in our faces, I fear.
Now you're spot on. Go ahead. Sure.
Right. So to go back to your original question is this compartmentalization, right? So the idea is that the IPCC climate change report, and including various reports coming out of the US government and many other governments, European governments, it's very clear, right? Irrespective whether we think it's a human induced or not, it is there.
It is there, and we must deal with
right.
it. So I'm going to pull from there, and I want to go over to you, Ethan, because you're right. We must deal with it. So now the question becomes, how can governments enhance their preparedness to deal with these things? Because remember, you guys posited at the beginning, governments are not prepared. They can't do it. So what would you suggest in this preparation?
So I really think we are at a stage where we need a real profound shift in the way governments think, where they have to move beyond sort of short-term, self-centered, nationalistic thinking and begin to realize we're all here, we're all breathing the same air, we're all drinking the same water, we're all basically in this boat together. And, as Benjamin Franklin said several centuries ago, we must all hang together, or we will most assuredly hang separately.
That's right. If one of us is not secure, perhaps neither of us is secure. Go ahead, Bishop.
And just on a point, we can say, I'm not going to really worry about countries that's name starts in Z, right?
Okay.
I'm only going to worry about countries that name start in like K. Fine. But you can do that, but it doesn't matter that the environment and climate is such that whatever you do is really not going to make a difference. Unless otherwise you have a collective approach. I mean, at the very least, we have to think the problem in such a way that you cannot let borders, nationalities, identities really drive these processes, because it's almost existential, right? That's what you're looking at. And if you're still going to be locked into our own internal differences and let that drive the process of solution finding, then we are going to be limited in our ability to save large parts of the planet.
So let's go deliberately then into the areas you're talking about. Let's talk about mitigation and adaptation strategy. Okay. So as we do so, explore the potential roles of cooperation and innovation. So, Ethan, regarding regional security cooperation, do you see a significant role in addressing these security challenges? And perhaps are there existing frameworks and agreements that could be instrumental in this?
Thanks, James.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think if we look at the Pacific Island Forum, for example, it's a wonderful organization. A bunch of small, rather isolated nations got together, realized they had common constraints, common interests, common values, and have built off of that and have built themselves into quite a powerful collective where the 11 truly small island nations, they hold a great deal of clout in the world. You could think their roughly 3 million residents hold the same number of UN votes as the 4.6 billion residents of the largest 11 countries in the world. So, yeah, yes, there are, I think, models out here. We need to improve on those and keep building. Okay. Srini? Beth, did you want to add that?
I guess if I might just add on the cooperation aspect to broaden it, you know, I've been reflecting as Srini and Ethan have been talking about the history of conflict. We have to date lived in a civilization where conflict was based on winners and losers.
Yes.
And often justifiable conflicts, morally, ethically. Now, today, it seems like a lot of that, and partially as a result of globalization, has gone away. You don't often have the right and wrong in conflict. You also do not have the resolution of conflict. Look at Syria. Look at Ukraine 2 years later. Look at the prospects for the Israel conflict and many others throughout the world. So the costs of conflict seem to be escalating. The benefits seem to be declining, but most of all, the way we measure success seems to be changing. So we look at a conflict like Israel-Palestine, for example, and traditionally we would think we got a winner and a loser here, and that's what we're going to measure. Now, perhaps I think based on what Srini is getting at, we're not measuring that anymore. The real measurement is what impact is this conflict going to have on public health, on the environment. And that implicates not just the protagonist, the antagonist, but everyone supporting either side. And the answer is nothing good is going to come of conflict on the environmental level, on the health level, and on the humanitarian level. In most cases, of course, there are exceptions.
You mentioned Syria, and we mentioned that in the paper. So it's a classic example, right? There's a crop failure because of rains and water shortages in the one part of the country. People migrate to the cities and other regions. There's internal tensions, lack of opportunities, job opportunities, and then they start protesting it. Outside actors get involved in it, and the government says, well, you can't protest because that's disruptive, and they attempt to silence the protest, and then it becomes big. External actors come in, the widespread war, destruction of cities, bombing, mass death, migration of people into other areas of the world, which would not, and if you look at the causal chain or the causal loop of it, it is really fundamentally, it's about inability to provide for themselves. And that is a story that is sort of repeating now as we speak in many parts of the world. And that's going to move a section of people in the Sahel region, in the part of Central Africa. And this is going to drive people to create all this conflict.
I mean, the health security implications of what you just spoke about, I mean, frankly, they were the crux to what you just spoke of. And it was manifest in, the various aspects of what you spoke about, whether it started off with
food insecurity, from drought, people not having the nourishment that they needed. But then, the migrating population, I mean, that is tremendous impact on humans. I mean, these have really tough consequences.
Correct. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, just because you mentioned health security, James, I'll just say very briefly
Please
that
do.
quote that I mentioned before we went on air from Africa, from Tanzania, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers.
It is.
And I think that's what we're seeing, the grass being
For humans.
health systems, being civilizations, and of course the evidence being the parties to conflict. And so I believe what we're getting at, Srini, is that the only real solution, and there have been many mass extinctions throughout history.
Yes.
We are not invulnerable.
We are not.
Although we may be the X-Men, we are not undefeatable. And the only solution, and this fits in so closely with APCSS, is cooperation.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ethan.
I just want to put a little asterisk on that, though. I don't believe, and I think there's good evidence for it, that climate change will drive humanity to extinction. It may certainly reduce our quality of life, might reduce populations in some areas. We are, however, I think, rather like cockroaches or coyotes or rats. We are flexible. We are very good generalists. We will survive somewhere. We will reproduce and we will thrive. The quality of life may be much different and much lower.
Yes.
But I don't believe we'll actually be wiped out by.
You're probably right. I mean, and I don't know that was real implication that we'd all be gone, but I think it is the larger point that quality of life we've come to expect in certain areas is likely to be drastically different.
It's going to be disruptive for sure, right? Just to give you an economic impact. And if you look at certain parts of the United States where it is more vulnerable to large hurricanes, the frequency of it means that many insurance companies have just
Yes.
said, hey,
We can't do it.
we can't do it.
Yeah.
To the extent many insurance companies are just going belly up. They cannot simply fund and refund and fund the construction.
There are parts of habited places where it is no longer a viable economic business anymore.
And that's going to happen across the world, right? So many places are going to become not livable. So people are going to move to places where it's livable. And that is going to be a constant source of friction and potential conflict where cultures and other identity issues come to fore and then they collide.
I'm going to move the conversation a bit, but before we delve into our audience's questions that they've submitted, I want us to peer into the future and consider policy recommendations for enhancing cooperative security amidst this climate and environmental disruption. So Ethan, we'll start with you then. Could you offer insights into the future outlook and prognosticate the evolving landscape of environmental and climatic change?
It seems to me that both our political leadership and our corporate leaders and really all of us have to make that recognition, make that leap recognition. This is not just another little issue to deal with, but this is really central to our issue, to our very existence. This has really got to become a focus. Environmental sustainability has to become sort of a pervasive theme driving everything we do, and a lens through which we examine the value of our actions. Until we can do that, I don't know that we'll get very far on this, but if we do that, I think we can really succeed.
So I'm going to push you a little bit, and I'm going to ask you to, enumerate some of these things. So we're talking about sea level rise. We're talking about what? Extreme weather event. What else? I mean, what are we talking about?
All of those and more. Yes, we have record-breaking heat waves coming.
Okay.
We have forest fires and wildfires of the extent never before seen. Last summer, Canada burned an area 6 times the amount that usually burns for its typical fire season. We have in the Himalayas glacial lake outbursts now happening. It's become a huge issue up in Nepal. So the types of issues are variable around the country, I mean, around the globe. But I think if we can shift to that environmental sustainability value system and begin to judge ourselves and our actions and our country's actions with that as a priority and sort of see who's number one in that, I think we can shift our actions as a species to be supportive, be very positive.
What happens if we have the ocean acidification? What does that mean for us as a people?
So that's extremely likely to continue. It's moving ahead. That's certainly, again, going to alter the ocean ecosystems, alter the food webs, alter the distribution of the protein available. We will have to, as a species, adapt to that, figure out either develop new species of sea life that tolerates more acidic conditions, and or figure out ways to control the acidity on a local level, both of which are, of course, going to be large challenges. And meanwhile, put up with probably a decline in the protein that we get from that sea.
And so you earlier, you had spoke about a water scarcity. I mean, you were talking about water tables dropping, aquifers becoming contaminated or being depleted, or, I mean, is this reason for concern, water scarcity around the world?
Certainly. A recent global survey found about 40% of the bodies of water they examined globally were severely polluted. Wells everywhere around the globe now, people are having to dig deeper and deeper, drill deeper and deeper to get at water, which typically means also the quality of the water they're getting may be more highly mineralized with vulnerable things like arsenic. So yes, we have in places like the Salinas Valley, the ground level is sinking at the unbelievable rate of about an inch a month because of the water being pumped out from under it and the resulting collapse of the aquifers. Yeah.
Say more about vector-borne diseases. You alluded to that a little earlier in the show.
So yes, those are becoming more common. Dengue fever, Bess, correct me if I'm wrong, but dengue fever is now popping up in Europe, parts of Europe, as essentially its carriers, basically, the mosquitoes that carry it are spreading their range. It's certainly, you've seen it here in Hawaii, avian malaria is moving up mountains and wiping out last remnant species of some endemic Hawaiian birds. This type of thing is going to only become more frequent, unfortunately. Fungal diseases are going to get far worse.
Ethan, thank you for painting that insightful picture of anticipated challenges. I mean, I think there is real value in enumerating the real challenges that we potentially face. And so thank you for doing that. Srini, building on Ethan's foresight, how do you envision the future geopolitical landscape in response to these environmental and climate induced events? If those things happen, sea level rise, extreme weather events, temperature increases, associated ocean acidification, loss of biodiversity, on and on and on. These things happen. What is going to happen to the geopolitical landscape?
I'm going to answer the question very directly, right? We are not even in the geopolitical terms, we are not elevating those issues to the level it needs to be. It's still at a level that is way below traditional issues, war and conflict, bombs and rockets and missiles and boat building and things like that we are doing, right? So these kind of conversations and education is necessary, not just here, but across the globe. Every school children in every part, because they're the ones going to be most impacted, have to be made aware of it at the very least, to make conscious of it. And there's already a growing consciousness. I'm seeing a growing consciousness in it, and they are growing up with the awareness. Reuse culture, recycle culture used to be big in Asian countries because we had perennial shortages of things like water bottles or papers. We used to write on the back side of the paper, sides of the paper. So we never threw away anything. And we got away from that. Some of it now, as production increased, we just said, oh, this is dirty, I'll throw it away.
So those are things we might need to do, and I wholly agree with you. But
On the geopolitical side, let me give you a drastic sovereignty, on which is the basis on which the states are divided, is increasingly likely to become irrelevant as a way of dividing us, right? Yeah, I am Srini, and this is my sovereign country, and I get to keep all this, and Ethan does not get to, and Bass does not get to. If we are going to think that way, and leaders are going to continue to think that way, then we are going to be limited in our capacity, what is going. And let me give you an example. The technologies that we haven't talked, we don't have enough time, but hopefully we can continue this conversation, future iteration. Green energy, right? Renewables, solar, wind, hydropower, maybe even nuclear, which is seeing a sort of a revival for large power generation, right? They do have the impact of contributing to power generation and electricity consumption on automobiles to reduce the footprint. But even there, countries are competing to kind of like, dominate it for them. And that's a problem.
So I thank you for flagging the importance of some of these technological solutions, because I think you would agree we have to get in front of this. Because if we're not in front of it, the probable reality is there's going to be great contestation for the scarce resource. From a scarcity, most of us look from a scarcity mindset, not an abundance mindset. I've got this, let's share. Rather, I need to guard every drop in my half full glass of water because there ain't enough there. And consequently, it would seem to me we're going to be a lot more fighting over resources, scarce resources. Not enough agriculture, products, I need the food. Not enough water, I need that. Not enough.
Yeah, just to your point, it's agriculture is already happening, right? There was massive food shortages in South Asia, particularly a couple of countries were enormously impacted by the grain supply chain issues because of the war in Ukraine, and preceding it was COVID supply chain issues. And that caused famines of great impact. And people were standing in long lines. There was no flour. There were no basic commodities like oil available. And those things are not only going to be, double in important.
If I could just add to
And when you do, pull this one to me, to this final one on, how do we fortify the health, resilience, and all of this? But go ahead.
Understood. I think another point that maybe we're getting at here is conflict does not create resources.
No.
It may get you access to resources, but conflict, lack of cooperation, ultimately consumes resources. Yeah, it only just occurred to me, and I don't know if I can prove this right now, but the idea is that if we view limited resources or climate change or pandemics as what is known as a common external threat, to paraphrase Ethan earlier, united we stand, divided we fall. And if common external threats are unifying forces, and I think we all have to hold up our hands. Our generation has not been a particularly benign one in terms of the environment and the planet, but there is a generation gap emerging. And we do have to look to the next generation who have been brought up with these values of climate change and recycling in a way that we haven't.
So Go
Just,
ahead, Ethan.
just a quick phrase from our mutual colleague, Ginny Watson, and I were talking about these issues the other day, and she used a phrase that I thought was really good. She referred to militant cooperation. And I like that. It's sort of like we all must learn to cooperate and
Yes.
enforce cooperation on a very broad scale in order to get through this.
Throughout our discussion, I heard several things. And let me just pull a little bit of that string tightly together on these things with regard to if we are going to pull on policies that fortify this resiliency we need, then we need to enhance regional collaboration. I mean, you were just saying that, Bass. We need to develop comprehensive action plans on climate and environmental disruption. We need these things. We need to invest in early warning systems because the things are happening and we need to be more prepared. We need climate resistant infrastructure development. We need to address conservation fisheries management, implement and enforce environmental regulations. We could go on. Anything to add on these things? I mean, there is just no end to the security cooperation we're going to need to get after to be as effective as we can for this slow burn crisis that is coming. And to some degree, we're in the pot being boiled right now.
Well, the very quick thought, I mean, open AI and artificial intelligence is in the news nonstop, right? It's on people's mind. And I'm at the very beginning of the chapter understanding those technologies, quantum and as well as artificial intelligence could be harnessed for finding better solutions. And they can handle the level of complexity that our
Yes.
brains can't. And I
think
think
you're right.
there is an opportunity there.
Let's go ahead and turn our attention to the questions that have been submitted. I consolidated them. There were many, and these are some consolidated questions. So, what impact do climate change have on developing countries, including alterations in rainfall patterns and geopolitical implications regarding vital resources like fresh water? Okay. We'd like to pull on that one first. What impacts does climate change have on developing countries? Ethan.
Well, in general, they don't appear to be good at this point.
Yeah.
It seems we are moving away from a sort of, might think of as a moderate cycle of a little bit of rain, a little bit of drying, a little bit of rain, a little bit of drying, some sort of natural rhythm. And instead, we're going to more extreme, more prolonged droughts interspersed by irregular but torrential rainfall. And therefore, we get sort of the worst of both worlds.
Mm.
This, of course, destroys agricultural endeavors, wipes out small farmers. It leads to a lot of human misery, causes the spread of disease. All those things, of course, can require more humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. They stress out governments because they lead to social unrest. So the prospects for developing countries are less than rosy, I guess.
If I could add
Yes,
to that,
please.
James, and not to be excessively optimistic, but we always characterize ourselves, in the developed world as having such strong resilience,
Yes.
and we do. When it came to COVID or whatever else. Having said that, certainly my experience in the developing world is there's a different kind of resilience there that comes with having to have put up with all of these and many other challenges on a day-to-day basis throughout history. So there is a strength there that I believe may help the developing world when it faces more and more of these climate change challenges, an inventiveness, a responsiveness, a way that they don't take anything for granted in the first place.
Thank you. I want to go on to another question. Within security planning, how crucial is the integration of climate consideration? Okay. And can the military play a significant role in addressing climate-related issues, such as mitigating migrations triggered by environmental impact? Go ahead, Srini.
Yes, the short answer, yes. It's interesting that since arriving at APCS, I've become more attuned to this issue. And thinking about it, for instance, there are plans, I don't know if all of them are public or not, but militaries will have to decide how they plan their airports. Where are they going to put the airports? How are they going to dock the ships? How many planes do they need to be put here or there? How are they going to position their ground forces? All of these questions will have to be answered because the existing facilities in some parts of the world are likely to go underwater if it isn't already going underwater. And you can see some of the folks are already involving a climate specialist on their staff and saying, hey, why don't you think about it and come with plans for dealing with it? I don't think every other country is there. They're not grappling with it. Even when you park a lot of planes outdoor, I heard it recently, in the open sun, what is the impact on the avionics on that one? It's very basic things like that.
What distinct strategies and actions are being pursued by different major powers, such as China and the United States, in addressing climate concerns, particularly in regions like the Indo-Pacific? And how might these strategies differ in their effect?
So the United States has a climate czar, Mr. John Kerry, Senator Kerry is been particularly appointed. We do have the Paris climate change treaty, or not treaty, or agreement, in which they have certain climate goals. Mr. Jim Hansen, the renowned climate scientist who's been credited with really making a movement, has become almost evangelical nowadays. He is not talking about climate change. He is talking about climate emergency. Climate urgency is what we're talking about. So the carbon footprint, where you need to reduce the amount of accumulating carbon, needs to be immediately addressed. That's number one. Technologies are there. All the others that you mentioned is important. I don't think we are there with an agreement. We still, whatever their limits may be, we need to get that done.
Much work to be done.
Much work to be done.
Indeed, we are basically heading in the wrong direction on that. That is, we have made pledges as part of our national planning to be reducing our carbon output. But in reality, the plans from all of the mining fossil fuel companies show actually we're going to be producing more fossil fuels, burning more fossil fuels for at least the next few years. And so is China. So is India. And
so we've got a lot of work to get
Yes.
after. Well, I want to express my gratitude for our guests, Dr. Ethan Allen, Dr. Srini Sitaraman, Dr. Sebastian Kevany, and for their expertise and their insights. But before we conclude, as we do with each show, I'd like to offer each the opportunity to share a book recommendation with our audience. So, Srini, you go first, followed by Bass, and then Ethan.
There's a book called Climate Conflict and Climate Change and Human Security, I think, if I'm paraphrasing. Just
And do you remember the author?
Marwa Dowdy,
Okay.
published in 2020 by Georgetown University Press. You can find it in online if you do a search
Wonderful.
of it. That's my best. I would also encourage, it's linked in our article, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report,
Okay.
as well as the National Intelligence Estimate, also put out by the U.S. government.
Bass.
I came across one called The Next 100 Years by George Friedman, which after some perusal seemed to really fit with this discussion in terms of solutions. It's not all good news, what he forecasts for the next 100 years, but
Okay.
10 years ago, we could never have forecast a pandemic. So
Thank you. Ethan.
But simply because I think we need to be thinking about this whole business differently,
Yeah.
I would recommend Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
We will add these books to our book recommendation list. Join me again in 2 weeks for an exclusive interview with Ms. Yoon Soon, a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center. In that focused discussion, Ms. Yoon Soon will illuminate China's perspective on Indo-Pacific security. With that, this has been the Security Nexus webinar. I'm James Minnich, and I urge you to stay vigilant and well-informed. And until we meet again, aloha oi.